The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. Now, when I first started this podcast, I had a few different goals, and one of them was this: to bring you the kinds of stories that you could imagine retelling to your friend in the pub or on a lunch break. And when I first came across the life story of the person at the centre of today's episode, I just knew that I had to share what I'd learned with all of you. This is the tale of Henrietta Robinson Green, better known as Hetty Green, whose eccentric personality and fascinating career gained her the nickname of the Witch of Wall Street. I believe she's one of the most interesting and unusual women you may never have heard of. So allow me to introduce you to this one-of-a-kind character. Since the Middle Ages, there have been some clear patterns when it comes to the kinds of women who have been labelled as witches. Often, but not always, they were middle-aged or older. They were usually strong-willed or quote-unquote argumentative, the kinds of women who were more likely to speak their minds, those who dressed a certain way, or even those who were financially independent. Relatively few of those accused of being witches during the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries actually practiced witchcraft, or anything even remotely similar. And although by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the witch trials of ages past were distant memories, the tradition of using the term witch to describe a woman who lived her life outside of the lines would still rear its head from time to time, and was often not used with any kindness. Enter Hetty Green, the Witch of Wall Street, who wasn't a witch at all, of course, but what she was one of the richest businesswomen in the history of the United States. And whilst the story of how she came into her great fortune is definitely interesting, her eccentric, sometimes ruthless, and incredibly frugal nature and reputation are just as intriguing. So, to help us try and fully understand Hetty's story, let's head all the way back to the beginning. Hetty was born on the 21st of November 1834 in New Bedford, a city in the US state of Massachusetts, to a wealthy family who had made their fortune in the shipping and whaling industries. And from a very young age, she was fixated on the idea of making money. Her grandfather, Gideon Howland, helped to raise her and introduced Hetty to different ideas and concepts to do with monetary success when she was just a child, encouraging her to read the financial papers and immerse herself in the business world. According to the Telegraph, by the time she was just 13 years old, she had essentially taken over the accountancy for the family business, which is absolutely wild to think about. And although this is unbelievably impressive, we have to remember that this was still the 1800s. As a teenager, alongside her financial work, she was also being coached and prepared to find a husband, one who her family deemed wealthy enough to take her hand in marriage. But Hetty was far less interested in the prospect of finding a rich spouse than she was in pursuing her true passion. She wanted to be a great financier. As the story goes, at the age of 20, her father purchased her an entire new wardrobe of fine dresses to help her in her search for a husband. And what did Hetty do? She took all of these glamorous new garments and sold them off, taking the money she raised and investing it into government bonds. She much preferred to dress in old clothing and had no interest in flaunting her wealth through her attire. I'm sure this decision went down like a lead balloon with some of her family members, but as it turns out, it was a perfect indication of the person Hetty would become later in life. But you can hardly blame her. By all accounts, the young woman she was becoming is the person her family had shaped her to be. Tragically, when Hetty was very young, her only brother passed away, meaning that she was the sole heir to the family's fortune. And Hetty recalled that from the age of around 6 years old, she was told and taught that she would be the one responsible for looking after what they owned. I can't imagine how intense all of this must have been for her as a child, but Hetty seemed to take it in her stride. Now, in 1867, she did actually end up getting married to a man named Edward Henry Green, who was a millionaire. So that box was ticked in terms of her family's requirements for a suitor. But immediately, we see another glimpse of Hetty's refusal to play by the usual rules and expectations of the time. In the US, for a big chunk of the 1800s, there was something in place called coverture. Basically, this was a legal concept that meant that once a woman was married, she was no longer her own person for all intents and purposes. Her husband would have an enormous level of control over all of her affairs, particularly her financial ones, and at its core, it was designed to leave a woman virtually powerless within her marriage from a legal perspective. But this idea was not going to wash with Hetty. Prior to marrying Edward, she insisted that she'd only go through with the union if he agreed that she could remain financially independent and that he wouldn't have any claim over her money. This was incredibly out of the ordinary, but ultimately it looks like Edward complied, and it proved to be an excellent financial decision on her end. Although Edward was rich himself, he also loved to spend his money, which led him to several serious debt-related issues as the years went on. By 1885, Hetty had had enough of his financial irresponsibility, and after refusing to help him out with any more of these debts, the two were actually separated, with Hetty reportedly giving him a modest monthly allowance. Now, as her career continued to flourish, Hetty seemed to split her time between New York City and New Jersey, along with Massachusetts and Vermont. And in the first of those, New York City, she became not only a very well-known figure on Wall Street in the financial district, but a pretty intimidating one too. Hetty had taken the money she'd inherited from her family, which we'll talk more about shortly, and not only invested it in real estate, the railroads, and other numerous stocks, but she also made sure that she had access to a hugely significant sum of liquid cash too, for the purposes of lending. But Hetty wasn't just a good businesswoman or a savvy investor. She was an absolute financial powerhouse. By 1905, she had grown and expanded her wealth to such a degree that an article in the Seattle Republican newspaper named Hetty as one of the, quote, world's richest 24 people, citing that she was at the level of peers of hers, including Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. Not quite as rich as John D. Rockefeller, but certainly wealthier than King Edward VII, the British monarch at the time. And notably, she was the only woman who made the list at all. So, with all of this considered, what do you think Hetty's life looked like on a day-to-day basis? Filled with lavish social events, the most expensive clothing and jewelry and homes? She had more money than most people would know what to do with, and crucially, it was all hers. But if you're picturing that she lived an extravagant lifestyle that was the epitome of luxury in the Gilded Age, you'd be wrong. If you're imagining that she was a little more modest, not wanting to be flashy or over the top, but still comfortable and quietly enjoying some of the finer things in life, I'm afraid you'd still be wrong. I described Hetty as frugal in the introduction, but on reflection, that doesn't really cut it. As was extensively reported, though often sensationalized in the press at the time, the life Hetty chose to live involved penny pinching to the extreme. So much so that, according to Charles Slack, the author of the 2011 biography, Hetty, the genius and madness of America's first female tycoon, the Guinness Book of World Records actually named her as the world's greatest miser, presumably after analysing her wealth level versus her spending level. So what did she do to earn such an unfortunate title? It appears that the public interest in Hetty's lifestyle intensified after the event which led her to gain the nickname the Witch of Wall Street. In 1902, her estranged husband Edward passed away, and from this time onwards, Hetty made what was then considered a pretty drastic change to her appearance. She started to dress exclusively in black, and I don't mean she wore just a simple, straight black dress. Hetty opted to don what was essentially full funeral attire every single day. I'm talking a multi-layered black dress with petticoats underneath, a black cape, black headpieces, and sometimes a black veil too. Honestly, I think she looked pretty iconic. But at the time, this was seen as very eccentric the longer it went on, and after it became clear that she was sticking with this full mourning dress indefinitely, those who felt that she looked somewhat spooky began to call her the Witch of Wall Street, and it stuck. Now, some sources state that this nickname predated the change in her clothing style, but I think what we can say for sure is that it certainly reinforced her reputation. As she now had this persona, the more people found out about the way she was living, the more gossip-worthy her life became. I mean, what's changed, hey? But if I'm being honest, I can understand it to a certain extent, because Hetty's lifestyle was pretty notable. Have a think about the most frugal person you know, and the kinds of things they do to save money here and there. Perhaps they spend a lot of time shopping around for essentials, only to save a matter of pennies, or find creative ways to repurpose what they already own rather than buying something new. Now picture that person was actually a millionaire or even a billionaire, and times their thrifty ways by at least 10. According to reports from the time, the person you'd be left with is Hetty. Here are just a few of the reported details about her daily life that help to build this picture of the Hetty Green that has gone down in history as this kind of female Scrooge figure. As time went on, she largely lived in rented accommodation in Brooklyn and Hoboken, and if you're picturing anything with even a hint of glamour or luxury, think again. Along with her 2 children from her marriage to Edward, Hetty lived in boarding houses and was said to largely refuse to use any hot water. One widely cited rumour is that she lived on a diet that consisted largely of a gruel-like oatmeal mixture, which she heated up on a radiator at her office. The term office might be a bit of a stretch in itself. Although she was making more money than most people could ever dream of, she spent most of her career working from a communal roll-top desk in the chemical bank in New York City. As this was the Gilded Age, a time of abundance where the rich would openly flaunt their wealth, there was a large focus on things like clothing and accessories. And whilst Hetty had this signature all-black look, it was perhaps less chic than we may be imagining. It's believed that Hetty had only one black dress at a time, which she would wear until it was way past being fit for purpose. And when she had this dress cleaned, she'd instruct the person doing it to only wash the parts that were dirty, maybe just even the very bottom of the skirt. Most infamously, it's said that this same principle applied to her undergarments too. This feels very gossipy to me. I don't think it's hugely likely that Hetty would have revealed this information to anyone, so I'm not entirely sure how the reports came about, but it's often been said that she would only replace her underwear once it had literally fallen apart at the seams. Certain stories from her youth have also been recorded. One details that on her 21st birthday, she was furious that candles had been added to her cake believing them to be a total waste of money. She apparently picked them off the cake and returned them to the shop they were purchased from for a refund. Now, of course, all of these things were Hetty's prerogative to do, and in a moment I'll get on to the reasons many believe she chose to live the way she did. But there were a few examples throughout Hetty's life of occasions where her money-saving measures firmly propelled her into that category of appearing to be a miser, or even just plain spiteful. I'm going to talk about two of them today. One which was a rumour that played a big part in how the public perceived her, but which ultimately may not have been accurate at all, and the other which was likely very true indeed and shows the extreme she would go to protect her fortune. Let's start with the former, a story which has haunted numerous accounts of Hetty's life for decades, but which I believe is largely false. To this day, many think that her son Edward, who was also known as Ned, actually ended up having to have his leg amputated as a result of his mother's reluctance to both seek and pay for adequate medical treatment for him. When Ned was just 7 years old, he injured his knee, and whilst many reports imply that the injury was not properly seen to, which meant that he ultimately lost the limb, the truth is much less sensational. In reality, doctors at the time deemed that whatever had happened to Ned's knee wasn't particularly serious, and it was only when he became an adult that the decision was made to amputate his leg. In a 1916 article which appeared in the New York Times, Ned plainly states that a lot of what was printed about his mother during her lifetime was untrue, and this looks to be a perfect example of that. It seems to me that Ned's amputation was more a result of the general medical constraints of the time, and I'm sure that if his injury had occurred today, there would have been a very different outcome. However, the second story shows Hetty in a much less flattering light, and here we loop back to something I mentioned earlier, the inheritance she received from two of her family members, which allowed her to begin her investing career in the first place. So, shortly after she became engaged to Edward Green, both her father and her Aunt Sylvia sadly passed away. Her father's estate was valued at $6 million. For reference, that would be the equivalent of over $100 million today in 2026. But although she was the primary beneficiary of her father's fortune, she was actually only allowed to control around $1 million of the figure. The rest was put into trust, for the simple reason that at the time it was believed that women weren't capable of handling extremely large sums of money. If you're watching me today, you may have just clocked my eye roll, but if you're listening, just know it was very much there. When Hetty's Aunt Sylvia passed away just 2 weeks later, Hetty found herself entangled in yet another will-related issue. She had anticipated that she would be the full recipient of Sylvia's estate. And how did she know this? Because she was the one who had written her aunt's will. She had allegedly spent a good amount of time convincing Sylvia that she should be the sole beneficiary of her estate, because without this money, she would be left in an unfortunate financial position, as at the time of the will's writing, she was a single woman in a world not set up for them to succeed independently. But when Sylvia died and her will was read, it seemed as though she had rewritten the document before her death. In this new will, Hetty would receive half of her aunt's $2 million fortune, but only in trust for future generations, whilst the other half would be divided between different organisations, including charities set up to benefit orphans and widows. Determined to fight against the acceptance of the newer will, Hetty entered into a drawn-out legal battle, in which she was accused of forging her aunt's signature on an addendum within the earlier document, which stated that this was the only will of Sylvia's that should ever be considered true. By all accounts, there was quite a lot of evidence to suggest that Hetty had manipulated the document, and the fact that she was, in essence, battling to take money away from all of these charities was not a great look. This legal case, known as Robinson versus Mandel, is actually particularly fascinating, as it's considered the first US federal court case in which forensic statistical evidence was presented. A large number of expert witnesses were called upon during the proceedings, including, quote, chemists, engravers, accountants, bankers, and handwriting experts to help prove that the signature was forged. And one witness, the world-renowned Harvard mathematician Benjamin Pierce, quote, used statistical evidence to support his conclusion, testifying that the phenomenon of an exact reproduction of a signature would occur by chance only once in 2,666 millions of times. This number far transcends human experience. So vast an improbability is practically an impossibility. So I think it's fair to say that some forgery had definitely occurred, but despite all of the work that had gone into the case, it was ultimately dismissed by the judge, meaning that Hetty didn't see any of her aunt's money in her lifetime. The figure that's often cited as the amount that Hetty used to begin her career in investment was $6 million, taken from her father's estate. But from everything I've read, it seems that she only had access to 1 million of this in liquid cash. Now, don't get me wrong, this was an enormous sum of money, and she absolutely had the biggest leg up in life to get her started. But the fact that in her lifetime she was never even allowed to vote on account of being a woman, Hetty growing her wealth to the point of being a billionaire multiple times over by today's measure, is pretty astonishing, as is what happened in 1907. This is absolutely wild. The aptly named Panic of 1907 was a financial crisis that gripped Wall Street for a number of weeks starting in October of that year. Unless you're heavily into economics, the details of why this happened are perhaps a little dry, but in a nutshell, following on from a huge earthquake that devastated San Francisco the year before, the US was thrown into financial turmoil as money flowed out of New York City towards California. This, combined with a number of other factors, including failed stock cornerings which ended up bankrupting certain brokerages, meant that the banks in particular were in a very precarious position. Many people credit the actual J.P. Morgan, the man, with leading the US out of this rather massive pickle. But there was another person who played a vital role in this recovery, after basically bailing out the city of New York, the witch of Wall Street herself, Hetty Green. During the worst moment of the crisis, she lent the city $1.1 million, having previously lent them $4.5 million a few months earlier. This woman, who wouldn't have even been able to vote in a local election, bailed out New York City. Do you see why I can't believe her story isn't more well known? All of the bizarre details about her way of living aside, her career was just fascinating. Many modern accounts of her work note that she seemed to have this incredible way of predicting what was going to happen within the stock market. She seemed to have these insights that few of her peers possessed. Could it be possible that more than just a few people felt somewhat threatened by her financial prowess? And if so, is it really any wonder that the nickname she was given had this link back to an independent, eccentric woman being labelled a witch? This leads us to two of the final points about Hetty I really wanted to discuss in this episode. One of them is about the idea that a lot of what was written about her during her lifetime was rooted rooted quite deeply in misogyny, and we'll get onto that in a moment. But first, I wanted to talk about some of the possible reasons behind her extremely frugal nature. One of the key points that almost every article about Hetty explores is that she may have gained her thrifty ways because she was raised as a Quaker. Quakerism is a largely Christian religious movement, and some of those who follow it choose to live very simple, somewhat minimalist lifestyles. They might wear quite basic clothing, eat relatively plain meals, and steer away from anything too showy or extravagant. This certainly seemed true for Hetty's family, and I think that this is what shaped her attitudes towards spending money on things outside of the essentials. Hetty actually spoke about this, saying, "I am a Quaker, and I am trying to live up to the tenets of the faith. This is why I dress plainly and live quietly. No other kind of life would please me." But as she grew more and more successful, I think a second element came into play. Some reports suggest that she had become quite paranoid about her personal safety as her wealth increased, and it's said that she even started to carry a concealed weapon during certain outings. By dressing in her all-black clothing, which often looked like it had seen better days, she was making sure not to give any obvious indications to those passing her in the street that she was actually one of the wealthiest people in the country. I think we often see this even today. I know that a few times in my life, I've met or been around a few people who are genuinely absolutely loaded, and you wouldn't necessarily know it. They're rarely the ones wearing the big, splashy designer logos or the huge diamond-encrusted jewelry. It's all much more understated, possibly because they don't particularly want to draw attention to their level of wealth while they're out in public. And it seems that Hetty felt this too. Although, of course, her affinity for all things simple stretched way beyond just her clothing choices. Which leads us on to the second point I wanted to discuss. The idea that the reason Hetty was portrayed as this kind of caricature of the witch of the financial world, who was mean and heartless and borderline cruel, was partly because she was an incredibly successful woman in a man's world. If it really was just her all-black clothing choice that the press felt made her worthy of a nickname, why not the Widow of Wall Street? Surely that would have been more fitting. But I believe they chose witch because it's what women who were outside of the norm were labelled as for centuries, and it wasn't meant as a compliment back then. But here is the twist. Those who knew Hetty personally almost never had a bad word to say about her. In fact, their accounts of her personality often depicted her as the exact opposite of the person the media described. Yes, she was extremely thrifty when it came to spending money on herself, but there are many accounts of her being very generous when it came to others. Her son, Ned, is quoted in the New York Times as saying, "Much has been printed about my mother that is untrue. She has been represented as being parsimonious, but such is not the case. She has worked harder than any man in New York." It's often been pointed out that compared to her peers, the male financiers of the day, she operated with far more kindness and integrity than they did, offering loans with far lower interest rates during financial crises than they ever did. There are multiple stories of her being a caring and compassionate neighbor, looking after those who fell sick, and even helping to save the life of a delivery man when she briefly lived in London. He'd fallen from a carriage and was bleeding profusely, and whilst everyone else stood around and observed, it was Hetty who stemmed the bleeding and applied bandages to his injuries. When Hetty passed away on the 3rd of July 1916 at the age of 81, many of the articles about her seemed to be based on the Witch of Wall Street persona. But if you looked more closely, the comments from those who actually knew her told a different story. The New York York Times reported that, quote, "The popular impression pictured this remarkable woman as being hard and close-fisted, with uncanny business instincts, but those who came into close contact with Mrs. Green remember her as a sweet-voiced old lady who won and merited the affection of her friends by many acts of kindness. It made little difference to those of her household whether her fortune was $100 million or $100,000. They only knew that they had lost a kind, understanding friend." One such friend of hers spoke to the newspaper, adding, quote, "In all the years I had known her, there had never been, to my knowledge, one person in close personal contact with Hetty Green who was not warmly attached to her." The arrangements Hetty had made for after she passed were kind of the perfect illustration of her absolute duality. She'd chosen to be buried next to her late husband in a cemetery in Bellow Falls in Vermont. And why had she chosen this particular burial site, first for her husband and then for herself? Because they could be buried there for free, of course. Then, on the flip side of this, she left her entire estate worth around $100 million when she died, which is the equivalent of multiple billions today, to her two children, split evenly between them. But unlike their mother, Ned and his sister Sylvia were happy to spend their inheritance, often by way of giving it to good causes. There are stories of Ned investing money into an experimental radio station at Dartmouth College and donating money to create the Hetty Green Hall at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, along with his sister, while Sylvia donated generously to aid the creation of Rockingham Memorial Hospital near to where their parents are buried. Neither Ned nor Sylvia had children, and in the end, all of the remaining money once earned by Hetty was distributed between 63 different charitable organizations. I wanted to end on this quote from a friend of hers, as told to the New York Times after her death, which I think really brings this story full circle. I know she has been described as harsh and mean and grasping, but no one was ever more misjudged. She was odd, it is true, but how many of us would not be odd if we were as free to follow our own inclinations as she was? I have never known her to do an unkind or ungracious act to those with whom she came in daily contact. She may have asked them sometimes to do strange things, but she never asked anyone to do anything which she was unwilling to do herself. And in spite of all her eccentricity, she was a gentlewoman. Well, there we go. That was the tale of Hetty Green, the Witch of Wall Street. I hope you found her tale as interesting as I did. I honestly could have talked for hours about the way she was spoken about in the press at the time. Even though she was far from perfect, I do think it's absolutely bizarre that she's not a more widely recognized historical figure. I think she was a true eccentric. Had you heard of Hetty Green before? What do you make of her story? If you are super interested in the financial aspects of this case, there is so much information out there about Hetty's business dealings and the way she operated, so feel free to do some further reading if that's your cup of tea. But for now, it's time for us to head on over to our Weird Media outro feature. And if you're on the lookout for a new addition to your bookshelf, this one is for you. I always love it when I get to do a book recommendation in Weird Media, and because I've recently joined a book club, it might end up being a more regular thing within this feature. The one I wanted to give a shout out to today is along the true crime thriller lines, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, I think you might enjoy It Should Have Been You by Andrea Mara. The book is partially written from the perspective of the main character, Susan, who lives on a perfectly normal housing estate in South Dublin with her husband and new baby. One day, Susan accidentally does something that would make most of us cringe ourselves inside out. She sends a message about a neighbour to what she thought was a private group chat with her sisters, but what was actually the big WhatsApp group chat for her entire estate. The message contains some pretty salacious gossip about some of those within the community community, which is awkward enough, but the consequences of this message being sent soon become more sinister and even deadly. That's all you're getting out of me about the plot. I don't like to spoil anything, but what I will say is that this book is an absolute page-turner. The chapters are short and sweet, and they focus on a rotating roster of characters. So you're constantly moving the puzzle pieces around in your mind, trying to work out where things are up to in the tangled web of this story. Even when you think you might have worked out one element of the plot, a new vital piece of information will crop up that will make you rethink everything, and the book does a brilliant job of keeping you on your toes. It had been a little while since I read a newer fiction book. I do tend to gravitate towards more of the classics, but I really enjoyed it. It's the kind of book I could picture taking on holiday actually. I have a vision of sitting in the shade with a drink, having a bit of a read. It definitely ticks those boxes for me. So if you're on the lookout for a new novel to get stuck into, It Should Have Been You is a great shout. Thank you so much for keeping me company on the podcast today. As always, in the show notes or description box, I'll be including shout outs and links to the sources I used during my research, so feel free to check those out. I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address too. Please do leave me a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or get in touch on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or Threads, and tell me all about your thoughts on this story. If you have a spare moment or two, a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts is always massively appreciated. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you once again for being here today, and I'll be back next week with a brand new Strange But True episode. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.